Welcome, everybody. It's a little after 10, so we'll get started here. I had a little webcam issue. I was hoping that you'd be able to see me while the presentation was going. It worked in our two tests, but it is not working right now. So we're going to just go through the presentation as is, and I will begin. Also, to let you know, you may type in questions throughout the presentation. If you think of something, we'll be answering all the questions at the end. If we run a little over, we are going to record this, but feel free to type questions at any time. Okay, all right. We're very happy to be this year's conference sponsor. We felt it was important this year to step up. We were not traveling to many of the events in the industry, and which there was a cost savings there. So we thought that we would give that back through a major sponsorship. So we are the conference sponsor for the Heat Show. We also did a match of 20% of anybody else who would sponsor the show up to our maximum. We hit our maximum several weeks ago, and I just want to thank all of the sponsors who stepped up this year to support the Heat Show and the great work that it's doing in the industry. So please use these, let these people know and let these companies know that you appreciate their sponsorship, and if you need their services, please use them. Okay, today, to give you a quick outline, I'm going to go through some valuation basics, talk about value drivers. We're going to talk about EBITDA, but I'm going to dig into it a little bit more than I usually do. EBITDA being gross profit minus operating expenses, but I want to talk about the earnings or the gross profit piece. And then I also want to talk about interest, taxes, and depreciation because they are having an effect on value. We'll look at some current value factors and the future outlook, and then we'll have some questions. The disclaimer here, really what I want to get across to everyone is that the numbers that we're using are generalities. When you see an EBITDA multiple, there's a big range of EBITDA multiples for companies. When you look at taxes, you have to look at your own balance sheets. You have to talk with your accounting people to find out how do these numbers relate. So that they're just generalities of how the various financial factors play into the value of the business. There's two basic types of valuations. There is a valuation as a going concern, and that is a company is going to stay in business, is not going to sell. That's used for estate planning, stock gifting, buy-sell agreements, or analysis, planning, budgeting, trend analysis, which is fairly important. And then there's valuations based on the sale of a business. And there's three different valuations. There's the fair market valuation. There's an orderly liquidation, which is when a company needs to be sold within a specific time frame. Basically a fire sale. Still got some time to sell it. It's not being liquidated, as in the last valuation, which is liquidation value, which is obviously the lowest. Okay, we're going to talk about return on investment. ROI, various methods. The most common one that people are used to hearing is the EBITDA multiple. The earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization. There's three basic EBITDAs. There's the owner's EBITDA, which is the lowest one because it has all the owner expenses in there. You have an adjusted EBITDA, which is what we typically use for valuations, which normalizes expenses, extraordinary expenses that wouldn't normally happen, owner expenses, that wouldn't carry on a sale of a business. But the buyer EBITDA is what we're going to focus a little more on today. And that's how a buyer is looking at a company. How are they valuing a company? Part of that has to do with distributable cash flow. And distributable cash flow is basically EBITDA minus capital expenses. So you have your certain earnings, but then you have to take some of that money and you have to buy trucks and buy equipment, buy propane tanks, whatever it is. So what you can distribute to your shareholders is a couple of different methods. One is EBITDA minus capital expense, minus interest you have to pay on any loans. Gives you a distributable cash flow, typically to unit holders, and then they pay the tax from there. In some corporate structures, it's EBITDA minus capital expense, minus interest, minus taxes, equals the owner distribution. C Corps are like that. Return on equity is very similar. However, it deals with an owner investment using borrowed funds. Okay, excuse me, a little technical difficulty. So return on equity, this is under the current bonus depreciation schedule. If a company is selling for 6.5 times EBITDA, and the EBITDA is 2.5 million, then the company's worth roughly $16,250,000. So if the owner puts in all 16 million, then that's 100% of their investment in the company, and they would expect a 15.4% return at 2.5 million. And there's no tax in this, so we're going to get to the tax piece a little bit later. If the owner puts in 60% and borrows 40% at an interest rate of 6%, then the return goes up to 21.6. This is the power of leverage. In the third example, the third column, if the owner puts in 30% and borrows 70%, then you can see that return on equity goes up to 37.3. However, that's really not realistic. When you borrow that much money on a company, this is the basis of private equity funds. When you borrow that much, you're typically bringing in some subordinated debt. That's debt that doesn't have first position, mezzanine financing, that type of debt, which is typically at a much higher rate, usually 10 to 12, maybe even 14%. So factoring it in blended average of 10%, you can see that the return on equity for this company is 27.9, which is still a fantastic return using borrowed funds. Okay, so you have EBITDA, now you have a multiple of EBITDA. So what drives that multiple? That's because your EBITDA times the multiple equals the value of your business. So the size of the business is very important. A larger business sells for a higher multiple. Propane in the propane industry, customer tank control is a very strong driver of multiple of EBITDA. If you own 50% of your tanks versus 80 or 90% of your tanks, the business is more valuable. Not just because of the value of the tanks, which are included in that multiple, but because of the tank control. The customer makeup, is it residential, commercial, agricultural? That will have a difference. Residential tend to have a higher margin, tend to be more valuable. Customer demographics, your median household income, your marketing in a good area, a good income area, vehicles and equipment age and condition. We've seen average ages of vehicles at 5 years, and we've seen them at 18, 19 years. Obviously, the one with newer vehicles that need less additional investment into the business over the next few years will trade at a higher multiple of EBITDA. Tank storage, real estate, is this included? Particularly on the propane side, tank storage is a major item that people are looking for. Is the real estate included? Is it leased? If it's included, higher multiple. Automatic delivery, particularly on the distillate side, is a major driver of the multiple. The presentation of financial information. If a buyer can easily see what that information is, understand it, have it presented to them, be able to verify it, it tends to drive the multiple up. The competition for assets. In companies that we've had on the market, we've had between 3 and 13, 14 offers on one transaction. So when you get good competition like that, you are getting a higher multiple for your business. Adequate number of drivers and technicians. This is something that's creeped onto the list over the last few years as the labor market has gotten very tight. People are asking, who are your drivers and your technicians, and are you properly staffed? Because they're hard to find. Is this a cash transaction versus an earn-out transaction? The product mix itself, propane versus heating oil versus motor fuels, HVAC. We have people that do insulation services. They sell wood pellets. So you got to look at the whole product mix to figure out that multiple. Safety and compliance, propane gas checks. Have they been done? In general, is your compliance in order? And that will drive value. Customers using automatic credit card payment. When prices were higher, this was more of a concern because it had to do with cash flow and ability of people to fund a transaction. It's still important. Exposure to natural gas and electric conversions. Areas like the Mid-Atlantic, as an example, heat pumps have taken away market share. So that's a concern. And is there natural gas in the area? Service contract percentages. So we represent some service-only companies, and service contracts are a major driver. It's residual income, recurring income, and that recurring income is a value driver in that end of the business. Non-competition concerns. What I mean there is employee non-competition. Is there an employee handbook that has non-solicitation? Do you have that signed by an employee? When you hire an employee, do you end up having a non-solicitation agreement as part of an employment packet? That's important. That helps. It gives buyer a sense of security. Concentration risk. If you have 1 or 2 or 3 customers that make up 10, 15, 20% of your business, then there's a little bit of a risk there for a buyer. And you'll either get an earn-out as part of that, or they'll discount the business a little bit if they see that. Customers on a budget is just another thing that's a positive. It helps make a stickier customer, so it drives EBITDA value. Okay, valuation basics. What has changed? It starts with earnings. However, interest, taxes, and depreciation counts. It also drives the multiple. Now we talk about EBITDA and then a multiple, but really these things drive the multiple, and it's been a little bit of a surprise lately. Hence the title of the presentation: surprises in business valuations. And we're going to go over these items right now. Amortization, by the way, has pretty much stayed the same at 15 years, so we're not going to address that. Here's the historical 10-year Treasury rates over the last 60 years. We are at historical lows on interest rates. And you can see over the last 20 years, the average yield on the 10-year right now is 0.7, but for the year it's averaging 0.91. I spoke with 2 banks about this, Webster Bank and People's United. And I was trying to get them to give me a benchmark so I could figure out, on average, what are the rates for a term loan to someone looking to do an acquisition. And as bankers typically do, I got 5 or 6 answers. And so I finally had to nail them down and say, what can I use? Can I use a 10-year average rate? And they were saying, well, we like LIBOR, we like this, we have a floor, But in general, this is pretty close. 2.5 over the 10-year average Treasury. for a good credit-worthy customer. I will say that banks have been one of the difficulties, especially since COVID. They're just backed up. You can look at these rates and you see how many people do you know that are refinancing their home right now? I mean, it's crazy. Then they get the PPP loans that they're processing the forgiveness. So the banks are very busy right now. But this, in general, is showing that rates are down about 2% from where they were 2 years ago. So on a 10-year loan at $5 million, you're talking about having 1 month where you don't have to make a payment. $57,000 less annual loan payment. So it's over a month. So this is a big deal, having interest lower. And as a result, businesses in general are worth more when interest rates are lower. It's very similar to the bond market and the stock market. People aren't putting money into bonds because the interest rates are so low. They're not putting money in their savings accounts. They're putting money into stocks. Same thing here. People are putting money into acquisitions. Okay, so let's take a look at interest and the effect on the return on investment, just going from 6% to 4% on the term loan. And here, again, you put in 100% of the money, that doesn't change. You're still at 15.4%. But if you put in 60% and borrow 40%, your return goes from 21.6 to 23. And that shows the interest rate in there. The 70% loan to the 30% equity investment goes from 37 to 41, but again, realistically, you're going to be using a blend. So going from an average of 10% interest using some mezzanine and subordinated debt to 8%, you're going to 32% return on investment. And again, this is one of the reasons private equity groups are very interested in our industry, and we get calls all the time from them looking for opportunities. Okay, so I wanted to show how this affects EBITDA. And again, there's never any straight line method to this, but this is just in general. What I did is to come close to the same returns. Now, obviously, you put in 100% and you're paying more for the company. In this example, instead of paying $16,250, if this company sold for $17,875, you'd obviously have a lower. If you put 100% of the money in, you'd have a lower return. If you put 40% in, I'm sorry, 60% in, you'd also have a slightly lower return. But if you're borrowing 70%, you're going to have the same return whether you pay 17.8 or whether you pay 16.2. And at the 10% versus 8% interest, it's the same thing. You're going to have you're going to go from roughly 28, and you're going to stay at 28% and be paying more for the company. So this is one of the surprises with the interest rates going down on why business values are up. I'm taking a step back to about 2.5 years ago when the new Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 came into play. This took effect 1/1/18, less than a year before the administration was changed. And these slides come directly from a presentation that we did with industry accounting firm Gray, Gray. So we went over these numbers and we found that this is a $1.5 million EBITDA company valued at 6 times. Again, whatever multiple it is for that particular company based on the value drivers. In this particular situation, under the old tax structure, the effective tax rate was 39.3%. And under the new structure, it's 27.3%. This assumes a state tax of 8%. State taxes will vary depending on what state you're in. So what we found is C Corps are paying 19.8% less tax in general. Again, every company is different. S Corp, 12.8% less. So it only made sense to us that this would push up values. So just taking those 19.8 and the 12.8% and applying them to the current range of EBITDA multiples, it looked like a 4-time multiple company. If a C Corp was buying it, they could pay 5 times and have the same after-tax return. Or an S Corp or LLC be 4.6. If it was 8 times, they could pay 10 or 9.2 for an S Corp. So this just, we looked at this and said, this has got to push values up. But hey, who are we to say that for sure? The numbers look that way. So what we decided to do was contact 9 or 10 industry buyers and ask them what they thought of our analysis. And I have their answers. Steve, I think your flow is fine. Each situation will be a little unique, but the drop from 34 to 21 certainly provides favorable benefit. The question I'd pose is, how long will the 21% remain? It could go back to 34 in the next administration change. If a company was on the fence to do estate planning, divesting, et cetera, then the answer to the unknown question could cause some to accelerate their plans within the next 2 to 3 years. That was from Mark Zamora, who at the time was with Energy Distribution Partners as Vice President of Operations and Corporate Development. Well, the next 2 or 3 years are here, and we are seeing some of the results that Mark had mentioned here. The second one, as I mentioned, pretty clever analysis, and I do see an expansion of ROI for C Corps, folks like me that derive enterprise value off of pre and post-tax distributable cash flow, which we're going to talk more about. It can make a go versus no-go difference. And then I like what Mark Cleves said here, must be something stressed in the Ivy League schools that they're still focusing on EBITDA, which we do see that people are still focusing on EBITDA and the old multiples. But we also see the successful buyers understand this. Mark is the CEO of U.S. Energy Finance and Capital. Steve, it appears that a C Corp after-tax ROI and dividend pickup should put upward pressure on values. A pass-through entity, such as an S Corp or LLC, appears to have less effect. Certain provisions are scheduled to sunset unless made permanent, and this may change the dynamics further. The government is still working on it. At the time, the government was still working on it, but that was a little over 2 years ago. From Jim Townsend, CEO of Townsend Energy, and Jim does quite a bit of acquisition activity, so his words have come true. We had a couple of people that did not want to tell us what company they were from, but we thought that the answers were very good, so we put them here. This is an interesting analysis. We still use EBITDA multiples as the basis for value, but I can see how values may have increased if the net income after tax has gone up. We're still working through the new depreciation laws and how that will affect value. If you use EBITDA, it should not affect the multiple, but common sense would say that accelerated depreciation, especially on used assets as in an acquisition, would be financially advantageous to the buyer. We're going to get into depreciation next. Senior management is not direct. This is a large publicly owned company who gave us this response. Senior management has not directly shared their thoughts on the effects of the new tax laws. However, the CFO has said that if they have to stretch to get a deal, they are more comfortable that they can get their return. There's certainly an impact, but we are not sure what it is, and we're still trying to quantify it. So again, over 2 years ago, we are seeing the effects of this. We are seeing increased multiples in EBITDA. We are seeing increased valuations because the return, the after-tax return to most companies has increased, and the cash flow has increased, and this has caused some of the increase that we had in this slide here. I don't think we have gone from an 8 to a 10 or from a 4 to a 5, but certainly somewhere in between. Okay, so I want to talk about depreciation a minute. I want to talk about the old type depreciation versus bonus depreciation, which is something that we have in effect right now. It's going to phase out, but it's in effect right now. So standard depreciation and this is for an S Corp, would say that in this same example that we've been using, if the hard assets are $7 million, and that includes land and real estate and propane tanks, this company would have a lot of propane tanks with that amount, and this would be vehicles and all in hard assets. We put a capital budget of 10% in here. That's because things like land and real estate you don't need to buy, but you do need to pave the parking lot, you do need to replace computers, and you do need to buy new vehicles, and you do need to replace, or if you're a growing business, add propane tanks. So the old adage we used to use when I was on the buy side for companies, and we were figuring out a capital expense budget, we would say depreciation equals capital expense. So that's what we would use, whatever our depreciation was, we would kind of ballpark that as being our capital expense budget. Okay, so under standard depreciation, this company who has amortization, who has income tax, who has money that needs to be invested into CapEx, would have a distributable cash flow. Their net income after tax is $840, but then they get the advantage of the cash flow of the amortization and depreciation. So they'd be able to distribute $1.4 million. Year two goes up a little bit because the CapEx actually, the depreciation goes up as you're investing after the first year, which is the acquisition year. Okay. Bonus depreciation. With bonus depreciation, you can deduct any amount of it, and if it creates a net operating loss, you can carry it forward or use it to go back and offset previous year's income. So that's a big deal. This was put into effect by the government to stimulate the economy by putting cash into the economy, and it's done it, and it works. And this, again, for this example, everybody's going to be different. But in this example, this puts $1,950,000 out in cash for the first 4 years because they haven't used up that bonus depreciation until they get into the 5th year. That's when you have to start, paying, your distribution goes down because now you're paying tax because you have income. You didn't have income prior to that. Okay, so how do these two match? And the title of this is cash, cash, cash. Distributable cash flow, standard versus bonus depreciation. You can see this is throwing off over $400,000 a year more in cash. And over 5 years, although year 5 you start to give back, it's $1.8 million in cash. Now throw on top of that, another surprise we've had this year is additional cash infusion from PPP money coming into the market. So there's a lot of cash out there. So what do people do with it? I know what we do with it in our household. We invest it or we spend it. And I think that's what people are doing in businesses. They're investing it or they're spending it. And they're spending it on infrastructure, they're spending it on other items that are depreciable, on things like tank monitors, on upgrading their fleet, computer systems, things that are increasing the earnings portion of the business. Or they're looking for acquisitions. We do a study of how many offers we get on businesses, and over the last 5 years prior to this year, we had averaged 5.2. We're up 16% this year on offers. We have people making good offers that had not been involved in the process prior. So we are definitely seeing acquisition activity up, which drives up value. Just a little note to sellers on this. We see a real wide range of allocation of the asset. In this example, that $16.5 million purchase price, depending on what the vehicles are valued at, and particularly propane tanks, we've had companies that have said the value of a propane tank in an acquisition is the replacement cost plus the regulator plus the piping plus the labor it took to put it in, and they want it allocated at that full number. Well, that's just, in our opinion, ridiculous. That it should be allocated at a fair market value. It's one of the things we negotiate for our clients. So you can see in this example, again, using a 37% tax rate, everybody's tax rate is going to be different. But the $16.5 million offer in offer A, the $15.9 million actually nets you slightly more after taxes. Now, if you compare offer B to offer C, it's a $500,000 difference. For an offer, that's a $500,000 less. So there's $1 million swing for an owner on that offer, but really it's proceeds after tax. So you have to be careful when you're looking at offers about the allocation of asset. And the reason I just, to go back there a second, the reason I say this is because of bonus depreciation. A lot of companies are trying to really increase that hard asset value of the items that they can use bonus depreciation on. Okay, so in general, let's talk about earnings. Gross profit, we've seen it up. When we saw it up in 2018, and we thought, well, product prices are down, so people are holding on to their margins a little bit. But then we saw it up again in 2019, and we see it up again in 2020. So that's a trend. When you have 3 years of up, that's a trend, and that's a good trend. Margins are up due to low cost of product. Residential volumes this year are up in many cases. It was a warm winter in the Northeast, yet we see volumes doing very well, way in front of the weather-adjusted averages. And we think part of that's due to people being home, kids being home, in and out of the house, schooling from home. Setback thermostats are not being used, that people are home during the day, so they're not looking for that conservation. HVAC and hearth products, general home improvements, earnings are up because sales are up in all of those areas. Barbecue tank cylinders was interesting. I've had some conversations with some people who this is a major part of their business. They're telling me 50% over last year up on barbecue cylinder exchanges, whether it's people home and cooking or using those patio heaters or the log sets more or whatever it is, barbecue and just in general cylinder exchanges up substantially. Forced advances in technology has lowered operating expenses. Here we are, perfect example. We're listening to a webinar rather than traveling to go to a conference. So that is cutting operating expenses. The same thing I've heard people are closing offices and they're not sure they're going to reopen them. They're thinking about having more work at home people, and they're finding that this really is changing the way people operate businesses. And we think that's going to affect earnings, not just this year, but in the future. So we've become more efficient as an industry, and that's a good thing. It's a good thing for earnings. So double surprise on that one. Okay, so the acquisition outlook. The Fed monetary policy is projecting continued low interest rates. I think I mentioned we're at 0.7% on a 10-year Treasury note as of yesterday. Bonus depreciation is going to phase out. So my sample did not have that in there. So it's going to be a little bit less, but it's going at 80% in 2023, all the way down to phasing out through 2026. So that's a negative. We like to see it in there, but it makes sense. The government has to start collecting taxes for all the trillions of dollars it's put out. A new administration may have negative tax implications for businesses. So when the current administration, was elected in November, and then President Trump was inaugurated in January, in 11 months we had new tax laws that took effect that That was December. They took effect as of January. If we go through the same scenario, we're going to see capital most likely, according to what the Biden administration is saying, is they'd like to move capital gains from 23.8 to ordinary income levels. They're talking about no cap or a high cap on Social Security wage base, both for the earner and for the company. So that's a big deal. That's 6%. Again, everybody's a little different, but it's around 6%. They're talking about changes in tax brackets up to either how they previously were or even higher for high wage income earners. So that's all negative. We mentioned the new efficiencies increasing earnings, and we think that'll continue. So that should help keep values high. Driver and technician shortages have put pressure on wages. So that's the one item that in particular that we see that's negatively affecting earnings. It's just hard to get them. And if you bring someone in at a higher wage, you got to look at your existing employees and what do you need to pay them to keep them. So we've seen as high as 10% increases on wages for drivers and technicians, which is huge. As a recession-resistant industry, banks and investors view us favorably. I will say that the banks have slowed the process. The transaction process, we're seeing it take an extra 6 to 8 to 10 weeks, mostly because of slow-ups on bank and funding and getting through credit committees. They're much more diligent and they're just busy. So that's the last piece to mention here. So with that, if we have any questions, whoops, go up to where the questions come in. And we've all of a sudden gotten we tested this presentation twice with the camera that would work, and today it's not working. And I am actually not seeing the questions. So bear with me a moment. Okay, got it. Okay, so let me work from the top down here. How has low carbon fuel standards affected value? That's a very good question. The industry is still working on it. There's some, it doesn't seem to have really had a big effect on values yet. By 2030, 50% of the fuel is supposed to come from renewables, lower carbon or no carbon, and in 2050 is supposed to be zero carbon. I'm not sure we're going to get there. There's definitely some pressure on people being concerned about that, but we really haven't seen that effect yet. What are the major obstacles a seller faces in closing a transaction? Well, for sure, the banking side of the business just being slow. Being a successful bidder, if you're going up against competition, is a major obstacle. And I'm hoping one thing the sellers get out of this presentation is you need to step up to the plate a little bit here. Your return on investment has gone up, especially if you're looking at a good acquisition, someone that really fits, that hits on those value drivers. I know you want to buy it as low as you can, but values have come up, and factor that into your models. Also, you should be looking at your own income statements and then layer in how does this affect it? What is your return actually going to be? Do the math on it, and then put in an offer that you can live with. Again, if you're negotiating one-on-one with the company, you've built a relationship, you're letting them know you're going to take care of their employees. And for some owners, it's important, and they don't want to shop it, even though we found that shopping it is a very confidential process. People do not leak it, at least a majority of the time, and the difference in purchase price is huge. I used to be on the buy side. As a matter of fact, my bonus was based on, we had a target acquisition number, and I could go 10% over that number if I needed to negotiate it. But for every dollar under our target, I got 2% as a bonus. So I could go 10% lower. You know, I used to shoot at 10% lower. So there's a 20% range on where buyers want to buy and where, you know, where buyers can offer. So we ask you to, as a seller, you know, you're the one who put in the time. You're the one who took the calls at night. You're the one who had to worry about your drivers and your technicians being there, and about getting product, and about banking and everything else that goes with running a business. So we think you deserve to have the highest value for your business. And that's why we like to shop it for people. So as a buyer, I would say step up to the plate and pay these sellers what their business is worth. Sorry, I get a high horse about that a little bit. Okay, next question. I have no sound or picture. I have sound now. Sorry, Bill. Whoops. Propane tank control is more than just tank ownership. It's a documentation of ownership via a signed tank lease agreement. Would you agree? Thank you, Jeff. Jeff works for us, and I'm glad he brought it up because it does. We struggle with it. Buyers struggle with it. We see holdbacks and transactions as a result of it. Have good paperwork. This goes with documentation. This goes with good financials. So that's a very important point. We've actually had transactions where buyers, we had one in particular, a propane-only company, and the buyer decided not to move forward because there was no documentation on any tank ownership. And so that changed things, and that company ended up selling at a lower price. So definitely get tank ownership in place. Do you expect values to continue to rise? I hope so. I hope that buyers will step up and see that values will go up. But in the long term, new administration change, probably not. Is this a great industry to stay in? Absolutely. I love this industry, and I love the people in it. And I think it's a competitive utility, and it affords a great living for the owners. So if people want to stay in this long term, I think that's great. However, if you're looking at a 1 to 3 year retirement plan and you don't have someone to transition the business to, I would ask you to take a hard look at maybe accelerating your plans. Because you will likely lose 20% of your selling price if all of the taxes change the way the Biden administration or Joe Biden has said. There's a great article in the Wall Street Journal called Read Joe Biden's Lips, New Taxes. And if that takes place, you'll be working the next 2 years for free. Whatever you earn the next 2 years are likely could just go to paying taxes. So that actually answers the next question about Biden administration. Do you think it's too late for a heating oil company to get into propane? I don't. I think propane is a great fuel. I think it's a good tie-in. I heard a statistic from Joe Rose, the former head of the Propane Gas Association of New England, who told me that 85% of his members also sold heating oil. New England's a dual fuel market, not so much in other parts of the country. So with the pressures on heating oil, with propane being such a versatile fuel that can be used for so many things, I think, particularly if you have cash, we talked about investing in business. If your business is throwing off more cash now, if you have money from the PPP, yeah, look into getting into business. Call the various associations in your area and find out about it and do your research and see what it takes. It couldn't hurt, and propane companies sell at a higher multiple than heating oil companies, not just because of the value of the tanks, but because it's just a very desirable industry right now. Any advice of those looking to purchase a business? Question, in your opinion, what is fair market value of propane tanks? Very good. Thank you, Thad. It is a good question. Fair market value, as far as when we do a valuation versus the value when we sell a company and allocation. Allocation has more to do with taxes, but I think a fair market value is the value of the tank, plus sometimes maybe the value of the regulator, because that goes along with it. No labor, and then some kind of discount for depreciation or obsolescence. It depends on the company. If the company's fairly new in the propane industry, then those tanks are newer and they're going to last 30, 40 years. So it's probably less. It's maybe a 15 to 20% discount from that. If you're talking about a company that's been in propane for many years, then you're probably looking at in the 30% range discount of replacement value. Approximately, that's what we would use in a valuation. Any advice for those looking to purchase a business? I think we kind of answered that a little bit, other than, do your homework, look at your income statement. Another common mistake people make who are buyers is they say, well, if we buy this company, we're going to factor in 20% attrition first year, 10% attrition first year. If you're going to have 10% attrition in the first year, don't buy the company. I mean, that'll be awful. You'll be known as the company that buys a company and can't keep any of the customers. I've never seen a 10% attrition in the first year on the purchase of the business, unless it was like we'll call attrition on a low value, discounter. But otherwise, put in reasonable attrition, 2, 3, 4%. Take a look at the trends that company has now. See what you can do to not have that attrition, and then do the math. Figure out what your return on equity is. Don't figure out how much per gallon it is. That's a bad road to go down. You got to figure out what your profitability is. Okay. Next. What are the major obstacles a seller faces in closing a transaction? I think we kind of went through that. I mean, as far as a seller goes, there are a couple other things I want to talk about there. One is attorneys. We had a very difficult transaction that we closed September 2nd, which we'll be announcing next week, a large company. And the attorneys were more interested in winning the battle than getting the deal closed. And it was awful. So, we were lucky we were able to step in and mediate some of it. Great that we have a non-practicing attorney on staff who helped us and helped them get through the process. But that's one of the big things is attorneys. Due diligence, being organized, having all the information that a buyer wants. The bigger the transaction, the more they come in. We actually had PricewaterhouseCoopers came in and did a full audit. And the other thing, we had to stop them at one point. They started getting into why did you make this much on this customer and why did you make that much on another customer? So you have to manage that process. Just a little plug for people who do what we do, who are intermediaries in transactions. I mean, you're an expert in running your business. You're probably not an expert in selling a business. It might be the only time you've ever done that. Look to professionals, just like you look to an accountant, just like you look to an attorney. We can help. And we'd love to work for you, but we know there's other people in the industry. Go with an industry company, an intermediary. There's many great ones out there. In the propane side, you have Propane Resources. You get Gary Papay and his group, just a couple that I know. On the oil side, you got Oil Heat Associates. Gregory and Gray does some smaller transactions. They're a partner of ours on the accounting side, but they're a little bit of a, they refer us more business than they compete with us on. But go with someone who knows this industry and get help. It'll more than pay for itself. Don't think you're saving a few percent on your transaction. It's enough. I'll get off my high horse on that one. Bob Williamson, Bob, your question didn't come through. It might be on the bottom. Kevin Beckett, thanks you, Kevin, for the great job comment. How has low carbon fuel standards affected value? We talked about that one. I think this is Bob's continuation. Steve, can you cover the difference between C&S again? Gotta remember. I gotta remember what C&S was. I'm gonna get back to you on that, Bob. I'll see if I have time. I'm gonna go back through the presentation. You mentioned the scarcity of drivers and techs as an issue for value. Other than asking the owner, is there any way to measure or access this? Is the EBITDA number lower on a partner buyout? Good questions here. Okay. Is there a way to measure? Yeah, when you could ask, how long have these drivers been with the company? What you can't ask, unfortunately, is how old are they? Because we're finding a lot of them are aging out and difficult to replace. But yeah, you should look at your own company. How many drivers do you need to deliver how many gallons? So you can figure it out, or you can ask the owner, how's your staffing? We had an owner last year that actually came right out and said, I'm selling my business. I can't find drivers and I don't want to see it erode anymore. I think he was hesitant to pay what the rates were. That was in the greater Boston area. So yeah, it's an issue. Work it into your models, and that will probably lower your earnings number. Is an EBITDA multiplier lower on a partner buyout? Very good question. We get asked this occasionally. In a 50-50 ownership, where neither party has but really both parties have a minority non-controlling interest, even though it's 50-50. It might not be a minority interest, but it's non-controlling. When you have a non-controlling interest in a company, it is not worth the same. So in a 50-50 situation, the partner who's looking to leave the business is actually going to get less of, the value will be less than 50%. We do that in valuations. Okay, let me see here. I was going to hide the names here just for confidentiality reasons, but I'm unable to do that. Let's see. From Neil. So all in, with all these changes, what has been the increase in multiples from 2015 to now that you have seen for a 100% oil and 100% propane company? Have you seen enough transactions to tell if the current tax and interest is really impacting the historic EBITDA multiple? Great question. It's difficult to quantify the actual numbers. There's a couple things going on with propane-only companies. What's interesting is the large public MLPs have been under a lot of pressure, and we've actually seen their public trading multiples go down. So it's difficult for some of them to to pay the higher multiple on a transaction. But we've definitely seen an increase. In that example I gave of the changes in taxes, we have not seen that increase go up as much as the tax change. And I think some of that's hesitancy that the taxes are going to change back. I would say we're probably up a solid on a propane-only company, solid one time. I think it's still a bargain for a buyer right now, more so than it was in 2015. Heating oil, probably at least a half a turn of EBITDA for 100% heating oil company. Again, there's so many factors involved. Does the company have a great website and they're growing their business through marketing, or is it someone who's stagnant and has had continuing attrition? So some of it's in your projections of earnings. You can't just look at this year's EBITDA. You can't look at 2015's EBITDA and 2019's EBITDA. You have to look at trends, because people are not buying a business for what it did. They're buying a business for what it can do. And so if they can implement, if they can reinvest and increase the earnings, you got to take that as a factor. If they're going to run it as a standalone operation under the same name with the same people, there'll be less attrition. If they're going to fold it into an existing operation, there'll probably be some attrition in it. So it all depends on how you model it. But in general, one time, probably at least one time on propane is a lot of competition for propane-only companies, even for high percentage propane companies, versus probably a half, maybe 3/4 of a turn on heating oil. Thank you for the question. Let's see. Meg Davis. Have you seen enough I'm not sure if these these might be two different questions. Have you seen enough transactions to tell if the current tax and interest is really impacting the historic EBITDA multiple? We've seen quite a few. I think we'll do 14 this year, we think. And last year was a great year too. I forget if we did 8 or 9 and 10 the year before. But we see a lot more offers when we're averaging close to 6 offers. We see what a lot of people are offering. To me, that's more of a telltale sign on how people are valuing things, is what's happened to the offers. And so I don't think people understand it enough. I don't think it's come anywhere close to the numbers that we showed, but I do know that there's an increase. So I hope that answers the question. Okay. We're going to keep going. If you need to drop off, we are recording this. Have you that same question? You referenced significant interest from the PE space in our industry. Most of the transactions closed in your book appear to be strategic. Is the PE interest new to the space? We don't like dealing with what we call unfunded sponsors. One of the questions on here came from a PE-backed company. We like dealing with PE companies who are in the industry, and there's several of them. They're backed by private equity, but they are in the industry and they have done acquisitions. PE companies, they entering the market, they want at least $10 million in EBITDA. There's just not that many companies. We just had one that we closed on, which was close to that number. And we attracted, our top 3 offers were for people not in the market. And so they were, I'm trying to think, 2 of them were PE-backed companies, and the other one was not. So they call a lot because they're very interested in the industry, but it's easier to borrow $20 million than it is to borrow 5. So that's what keeps people out a little bit, is it's a very highly fragmented industry. It also attracts people to it because it's a highly fragmented industry. So while we get a lot of those calls, unless they're bigger transactions, it's difficult to close with someone that's not in the industry. Hope that answers your call. Do you expect CapEx investments in remote monitoring and connected tank gauges to help valuations with a shortage in labor? Absolutely. There's no doubt. Tank monitors, I think, are one of the, they used to have the old Skulltel system, which sounded good, but it didn't give you the accuracy that we have now. Will calls are going to turn into we calls. It's going to be automatic. We're going to be able to tell with degree days and tank monitors as soon as they come more into the market. We're going to be able to tell when a customer is going to run out. We're going to be able to contact them and say, by the way, we know you're on will call, but according to the weather and according to our tank monitor, you got 6 days before you're going to run out. It's very, very cold out. We're running 2 or 3 days for deliveries. Can we send you a delivery? I mean, that just takes the whole will call piece out of it. I think they are one of the best investments today. If you have cash, it's something I highly recommend you look into. Is it going to help shortage of labor? Absolutely, on the driver's side. We've done some return on investment presentations in the propane industry, and your driver costs go down, your gallons per delivery go up, so you need less drivers, and that really helps. That's a great question. Thank you. Let's see, from Dave. Would it be better to transition a company to the next generation? Yeah, it depends on the next generation. Can they do it? Again, it's a great industry. Where else are you going to go to service a customer base like this? But you have to also look where you are. If you're in an area that's gotten decimated by natural gas, and it's tougher to make a living, then it's not a bad time to get out. Will valuations go down? Maybe. If you continue to grow your business and you continue to attract businesses through good marketing, if you continue to increase your operating efficiencies through things like tank monitors, yeah, transition to the next generation. This is a family business. Again, I personally love this business. We do help owners when it's time for them to retire. But I would, if I ran a company and I had a child that was very interested in it, I still think it's a great place to earn a living. But it depends on the child. Your father did good, right, Dave? So thank you, Bob. C Corp versus S Corp. I appreciate you clarifying that. So going back to your question, can you cover the difference between C and S again? Yeah, as far as where I spoke about it first was about taxes. So C Corp tax advantage under the current tax laws is much better. If you're looking to sell your company, you don't want to do that. This last transaction we closed on, they waited 5 years because it was just too much money. So they converted to an S Corp before they made the sale, because that was just, the double taxation on a C Corp. There's some strategies around it, personal goodwill, putting more money in a non-compete, or consulting agreements. There's some ways you can beat some of that tax, but in general, not as good a structure if you're selling your business. Currently, a better structure tax-wise, and if you're going to remain a C Corp, great time to do acquisitions. Bonus depreciation is fantastic right now. I was looking at a 6.5 multiple. If you're looking at heating oil companies, where it's a much lower hard asset value, you can definitely, the first year or two, you might see no taxes at all because of bonus depreciation, and you can catch that before the phase out, which is kind of nice. And I understand participants are not seeing names on questions, so that's good, because I do want to keep it confidential. I got to thank you for a great presentation. And I want to thank everyone for joining us. I know we ran over the time slot. We are recording this. Sorry about the technical difficulties and not being able to see my smiling face. Very excited about this subject, and please send me an email or let me know if you have any questions that I haven't answered. And with that, I will end the presentation. Thank you.